December 7th, 1941, 10 in the morning. The United States suffers one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. With 2,403 dead and her once invincible Navy decimated, America is forced to join the conflict already raging in Europe and Asia. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine had swept across China, cutting off American aid, and then pressed on into Burma with limited resistance. At home, Japan was building up a seemingly superior naval fleet, led by some of the world's largest aircraft carriers. But Admiral Yamamoto's prediction had come true. The aftermath of the Day of Infamy had indeed awakened the sleeping giant that was America. As the Emperor's armies marched toward the Philippines, the United States takes action. With American armed forces now fully engaged in war, Japanese-occupied South Pacific islands are feeling the pressure. But hopes are crushed for a swift Allied victory in the Philippines. After a long, bloody battle, General MacArthur is ordered to retreat. Thousands of troops are left behind and forced to surrender. The enemy now controls the Philippines. MacArthur vows to return. In a bold offensive move, the United States prepares to land 10,000 troops on Guadalcanal, a relatively unknown island, where a strategic airfield is under construction by Japanese forces. When John Adams formed the Marines in 1775, an entirely new method of warfare was born. Unlike armies that marched cross-country to battle, the Marines were amphibious, launching their attacks with shore landings. In the decade before World War II, the Marines began to truly develop their style of combat. This preparation paid huge dividends in the early days following America's entry into the war. Guadalcanal was taken and secured with almost no loss. However, swift Japanese counterattacks led to a tough and costly campaign to hold the island. Despite the brutal climate and high number of enemy troops, the Marines, aided by U.S. soldiers and local inhabitants, were finally victorious. Later in the war, the Marines and their unique battle tactics would prove invaluable. Burma was an important Southeast Asian land supply route for the Americans as well as the Japanese. Control of Burma meant control over a key artery for supplies traveling in both directions. Enemy forces used this route to send looted wealth south to its aircraft carriers. The United States depended on Burmese roads to lend support to the Chinese in their fight against Japanese occupation. The most successful form of transport in Burma was the railway system. The air routes were inefficient, and the sea belonged to the Allies. With the forced labor of slaves and prisoners, the Japanese laid track at breakneck speed, at a tragic cost of many lives. As the battles were fought in thick jungle, control of Burma changed hands several times. But finally, the Allies seized control. Despite heavy losses in battleships during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States fleet was able to maintain their naval strength. This feat was accomplished by the strategic use of aircraft carriers, as the United States quickly determined that air power was the future of naval superiority. The Japanese realized this as well, and began amassing one of the largest fleet of carriers the world had ever seen. The two seagoing forces met at Midway in early June of 1942. After 3 days of intense fighting, the Japanese had lost many of their large carriers and were forced to retreat. The victory at Midway marked a turning point in naval warfare. No longer were the number of battleships the most important factor. The nation with the greatest carrier fleet was king. In 1944, 2 years after General MacArthur had been ordered to leave 70,000 of his troops stranded, the United States would return to the Philippines. The road back to save MacArthur's men was not easy. Admiral Nimitz's overall attack plan involved a direct route to Japan, which bypassed the Philippines altogether. MacArthur appealed to the Joint Chiefs and eventually gained their support. In October 1944, MacArthur landed on the island of Leyte, declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." MacArthur proceeded to regain control of the Philippines. However, less than a third of the troops he had left behind were rescued.